Hey, Yulia, it's great to see you today.
Hi, Jason. Nice to see you.
So, listen, you've written a book about your time working with President Zelensky, and that's pretty amazing that you got to work so closely with the senior Ukrainian leadership. So, you know Ukraine well. And now there's a lot of conversations going on globally about what's going to happen next with Ukraine. Is there going to be a peace deal? Is there not going to be a peace deal? What do you think? What's the perspective? And do Ukrainians want to have a peace deal at this point?
Well, Jason, hard question to answer, right? But I'll try to say my thoughts. First of all, yes, I'm working with Zelensky for 2 years as his press secretary, and I know him pretty well and everyone in the government, let's be frank, and in the parliament. And I was working with the New York Times before that. So I was in, politics or near politics for quite a time. I would say that despite anything, what's going to happen next, I'm proud of my people who stand here for freedom, who stand for the values that every American shares, that every European citizen shares. And despite any political games, I must say the people of Ukraine fully deserve to be supported and fully deserve to preserve their national identity and to stand free. The other question is more complicated, is how the war is going to continue or to finish. And what I see is that majority of the people whom I know in Ukraine from different parts of the country, they want some kind of ceasefire. And that was happening, that was also demonstrated by the recent Gallup polling that said that 52% of Ukrainians want a ceasefire as soon as possible. So here we talk about this big political and geopolitical game when nobody knows what's going to happen next, but everybody understands that some kind of peace negotiations is coming, is approaching, and here is the thing: how to make Russia negotiate, how to actually negotiate for Ukraine when around 20% of Ukrainian territory is occupied by Russia. So we see this very, very complicated behavior from the Kremlin. They try to say that they want some kind of peace deal or ceasefire or whatever, that they agree for something. But at the same time, around 8 or 9 regions of Ukraine are being heavily shelled every day with artillery, with missiles, with rockets, with air guided bombs, with different types of new weapons. People live there just in hell. I'm telling you, just in hell every day. And so my question is, if Russia says that they want some kind of a ceasefire deal, why don't they stop? This is the first thing, right? In my home region, in Kherson, people are hunted. Civilians are hunted by drones every day. This is terrifying. People cannot go out from their homes, for instance. They cannot drive. They cannot take a bus because then there is a Russian drone. They can drop a bomb there, or fall on them or explode, and they just simply die. So the situation is so terrifying that, if Russia wants something, Russia needs to show that, we can stop actually.
Mhm.
You know, we we want to stop or whatever. The second biggest question is, who is going to survive the war of attrition? Russia has more people, at least 140 million people. Ukraine used to have 40 million, and now, by different estimates, from 25 to 30 million people left. Then the second thing, Russia has a lot of money, economy, tries to avoid sanctions, try to sell the oil, has gas. Ukraine doesn't have that type of economy. Economy is collapsing here. So the war of attrition is really a huge question. Can we stand further? And I have even this question: if we give Ukraine all the possible money in the world and all the weapons, can we stand? The third question is, I don't believe that it is possible to have a long term peace today, but we can have a ceasefire. We can build the fortification that we did not manage to build. We can train our army aligning with the standards of NATO.
I am curious what happens going forward. At this point, we see very clearly the Ukrainians don't want to be part of Russia. There's no doubt about that. But you remember, for decades, the majority of people did not want to join NATO. Ukrainians said in polling that no, we don't want to join at this point, and they had concerns about joining the European Union. What are the origins of that? And obviously today it's changed, but at some point there was a nostalgia for a different period of time, or a hope that perhaps avoiding NATO membership would avoid a future conflict with Russia. But how did that start? Where is it today? What do you see?
Well, I'm from the south of Ukraine that was fueled with Russian propaganda in 90s and 2000s. And people there are hugely supportive of the European Union and NATO today. But I remember those times when they were literally afraid of European Union and NATO because Russia was brainwashing them. And Ukraine did a lot of very difficult choices to get rid of Russian propaganda. But I know that it is so, so dangerous. It convinces you that this is your opinion, but it's not. It's just, Kremlin's brainwashing. My mom, by the way, she started traveling to the European Union. She visited two countries for the first time in her life. She is over 60. And she came back and, she lives under shelling. She lives in hell. And she had like this 2 weeks in the European Union. She came back and she said, this is paradise. And actually, meeting those people in the European Union, seeing how they live, uh, it gives hope, and it strengthens the position that this is our way. We want to be like European Union. We want to have strong nations. We want to have, we share the same values. This is it. But yeah, my opinion is that the first thing is Russian propaganda. It is very, very, very underestimated. It's weaponized. It's very dangerous, crucially dangerous. And the most important thing, it it doesn't have borders. It acts here and it acts in Europe and it acts in China and it acts in the United States, everywhere. You might even not know that it is because it's acting in different languages too, in English language. And in English language, it's the same convincing and as in Russian because it plays with your emotions, it manipulates with your fears, it really targets your heart and mind. So my opinion is that we all need to be smarter. We all need to figure out how to find facts, how to stick to the facts, how to be smarter, how outsmart Russian propaganda. This is the first and fundamental thing to do. And by the way, I tell about the influence of Russian propaganda and how it influences everyone in my book, The Fight of Our Lives, because I was the target for it. One of the big things that I survived was that Russian propaganda shared the news, which is absolutely not news, absolute fake, that I was pregnant with Zelensky's baby. And it went viral so much that, like, literally every post Soviet country believed that. And even Lukashenko's advisor from Belarus, was calling me to figure out how I was feeling. This is terrifying. It's like you live in the world that doesn't exist. Your image is absolutely faked and fabricated. And if you go through this, you understand it's lies. But if you see these lies about someone else, you have doubts. You're like, okay, this person is like that because I read greatly written news, whatever. So my first point is that we all need to stand against Russian propaganda. We need to be smarter. We need to facts. We need, to be mature today because this is the era of mature nations.
That's just the thing. And what's interesting about Russian propaganda is I don't think we appreciate how it functions. It's not going to be posters saying Vladimir Putin's a great leader because they know very well that's sort of a message inside of Ukraine. It's not going to have any positive impact, nor would it really in any country. But what they can do is target people differently. So I recently heard in Ukraine, every single day, 12 to 15 full Russian campaigns of propaganda begin. And the campaigns, I mean, it's multiple videos, multiple things on social media all promoting messages that are actually different. They're not identical. For instance, there might be one saying, I don't want my son to die in the war. I'm not going to allow him to go. That's trying to get people to not send their kids to the military or discourage them. A different message might be something like, this war costs so much money and we can barely afford to eat. This is crazy. We have to prioritize being able to feed our families first. And a different message might ultimately just say, listen, this is just going to go on and on. I don't think I'm willing to die for Crimea. Forget the place. We don't need it. So it's really not pushing something that says to support Russia, but it's rather pushing things that have the population then subdued or not resisting Russia. It's not saying surrender to us. That wouldn't be a good message. It wouldn't be effective. But what's even more interesting to me is who are behind these messages. And it's not just the Kremlin. The Kremlin uses proxies, Russian oligarchs, or even Ukrainian oligarchs who live in Russia, to do these messaging around the world. So they are able to put pressure on them, to encourage them, let's say, to put out messages that would help the Kremlin's global narrative. So when these oligarchs living in Moscow realize they want to continue doing business with the Russian government, then they should be doing more to help the Russian government. And this is one of the ways that they can do it. So when it's decentralized, it changes things. But where it gets more interesting, even yet, is let's look at how Russia uses oligarchs in other countries. We've seen in Moldova and other places that Russia operates via oligarchs. And why that's interesting to me and fascinating to me, and it brings up a policy question, is what can the government do if, for instance, a TV station is privately owned by an individual who happens to espouse what would be considered pro-Russian viewpoints? Because if it's a private individual and it's not the Kremlin, we can figure out how to close down Russia Today or Sputnik News because it's financed by a foreign government. But how about if it is private money? So what is a reasonable solution? And honestly, I don't have a good answer to this. What do you do if you realize that somebody de facto, but not legally, is operating in the interest of the Kremlin by opening TV stations? Is it legitimate to close them down, or is it not?
Well, huge. So, yeah, propaganda is very chaotic. And they don't necessarily talk that Russia is good. They mostly talk about what is important for you. And they try to manipulate with the message in such a way that you want to support the narrative that is favorable for Russia. The second thing is Ukraine did a very dangerous thing that worked for us well in terms of Russian propaganda. We had Ukrainian TV channels owned by a person well connected to Putin. And those three Ukrainian channels that were registered in Ukraine, in fact, were showing all the messages for Kremlin. There were a lot of fakes, like literally fakes. There was prejudice, non-objective opinions, or included only one opinion, and there were a lot of lies. And President Zelensky in 2021 took this really very difficult political decision, and he actually shut down those channels. And I'm not encouraging anyone to do that because this is definitely about freedom of speech, and this decision caused a lot of concerns. But in fact, in some time, even the European Union recognized that that was a very needed decision because these were the channels of lies. There were no like TV channels as we can imagine. The TV channels appear to be an instrument for more powerful thing for weaponized propaganda of Russia. But in fact, I think we need to find for more civilized ways of managing this, and perhaps we need to rethink what journalism is today, because all journalism suffers of centralized titles and opinions from social media, from being very polarized today. And in many ways, I see that real journalists, they use the instruments of far radical tendencies, trying to respond with more truthful thing. But in this case, they in many ways look like, look the same as those far radical platforms, as if you understand what I mean. So the first thing, we really need to think what journalism is, what our standards are in the era of social media and artificial intelligence. And we need maybe to have some watchdogs who are very trusted and who can actually put the rules together that would be the same rules for everyone, right? And those watchdogs, they should be from the people who are being trusted and who have proved to be themselves with their names and image trusted journalists who stand for truth. It's a very difficult thing, and I must say there can be a lot of ideas about that. I told you about radical ideas about shutting down the channels, and I'm offering you something civilized. But Jason, maybe you have something in mind too, because this is a very, very difficult question.
It's really a hard question. Because fundamentally, how there somebody just happens to have viewpoints that are against the state's security? Somebody can actually believe that the Chinese Communist Party is a force for good in the world. It's obviously not. Now, if they wish to espouse that on their own dime, and let's imagine they're doing it without direction from the Chinese. Let's imagine that they themselves decide to invest their money in that. How can you stop them? Because their viewpoint is not healthy. But in a democracy, you're allowed to have very unhealthy viewpoints. So I think overall, it does present a serious challenge as to what the state can do that does not blur the line between freedom of the press and totalitarianism. At the same time, it's very common for politicians to criticize journalists or to criticize the news as being biased, to be against them. And so, what do you do at this point when you're also dealing with politicians who already have a tendency of saying the press is against them? To not say, well, in this case, it really is against the state, not just me personally, but it's against the state's interest. So the issue gets more and more complicated. But for Ukraine, let's think about the oligarchs a little bit more. They obviously, leading up to the full-scale invasion, had very large influence in the politics of Ukraine. And today, they obviously have influence, but it's changed. Going
Yeah.
forward, what is the role of the oligarch in Ukraine? Do you think there's a chance it'll be broken? And one of the things that I've always thought made Ukraine actually more democratic, oddly enough, is that unlike Russia, where it's a top-down approach, the Kremlin dictates to the oligarchs what they can do or cannot do, and it's controlled by them. Vladimir Putin is the linchpin of the oligarchs and the Russian mafia. In the case of Ukraine, it's never been centralized. There's been different factions. They fight with each other. They have different means of communication. And
Wild.
so, yes, they're very democratic, really. So when you compare that, what do you think the future is? Do you think that Ukraine is going to still have an oligarchy that actively controls a lot of what happens in the press and what happens in politics? Or do you think that's going to change at this point?
Well, you're very correct that even despite we have oligarchs, it's very different than the Russian system. There is no vertical here, and everybody was defending his. It's his only in our case, his vested interests. I must say that war undermined the influence of oligarchs hugely. It's not like they're not trying; they are trying, obviously, to influence politicians and media, and trying to buy journalists and members of parliament. But the thing is that war really undermined a lot of them. So yeah, they lost a lot. They owned industrial complexes and they lost a lot. Some of them decided to try to play by Western markets rules, which actually makes them better professionals, if I can say so, because they try to diversify their means, their resources, and businesses to go further to the West, which makes them play by Western rules. The other thing is we have one oligarch who used to brag with being very influential in 2019 and 2020. Now he has been in jail, like I think for a year or whatever. He's been sanctioned by the West, and now he's jailed. When he tries to do something, but it doesn't work. So I think that the influence of oligarchs really reduced. And by the way, one of them, the richest person in Ukraine, he actually shut down his media empire in 2022, being afraid of anti-oligarchy law that was initiated by Zelensky. I would like here to be, less maximalist and infant. I don't think that the oligarch question is out of the agenda in Ukraine. I'm afraid that there are people who would like to monopolize power, and this is just the kind of mindset when they want to, to become new oligarchs, let's say so. That's why I'm really insisting on the idea of restoration of democracy here, because we've done a lot of reforms and we have a lot of safeguards there that would stop this monopolize and abuse of power. So my point is that it's very different. Oligarchs lost their power. Some of them try to diversify to Western markets and try to play by Western laws already, which perhaps is good or whatever. And it's very different from Russia. And the most important thing that we need to focus now is actually not in any way not to allow Ukraine to have the new system of oligarchs that would resemble Russian one.
Absolutely the case. Iuliia, it was really great catching up with you today. Thanks for your time.
Thank you a lot for having me, Jason. Good luck to you.